person and everybody who's online. Still getting used to speaking to the internet, but this is good. So glad everybody can join in. Genesis chapter 2, verses 7 through 25. So the opening question there is, why did God make man before the woman? Anybody know? Anybody got a guess to that?
He saved the best for last.
Good job, Janice.
Yeah, I mean that could be. That could be. Anybody else have another response to that?
Because man was made in his image.
Well, yeah, it's actually the answer to it is that because God did not want any advice on how to do it. Yeah.
No, I like
So-
mine better.
Yeah.
I think that's more real than that.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I thought it was good. You guys were already laughing when I came down, but I thought that was, so Bible jokes, they're great. Anyway, when we come to this creation narrative, though, as I've said before, it's of paramount importance, and really the creation ordinance, the way that God had ordered things, actually is a way in which he sets the way that things ought to be. So sometimes we read things and we go, well, maybe this is one way, and so maybe there's some other things, but the way Jesus quoted it in the New Testament, in the Gospels, was that this is the way that God designed it, this is the way that God wanted it to be. And so the apostles also take it clearly. So it's sort of like our United States Constitution. It has enumerated powers. Today, most lawmakers read the Constitution and say, well, we could do everything except what it says, or we could do what it says and everything else that it doesn't say, when really the Constitution is like, do this, and then don't overstep your bounds. Mm-hmm. So really looking at Genesis is kind of the same way. It is, here is what you are to do. And the way that God designed it, not like he designed it opposite and then said, oh, go do something that's completely opposite of what you want to do. What he's saying there is, this is the way I made you to live and to prosper in this creation. So just as a recap, a review of verse 7, it's a review that man's body was made of the dust of the ground, and then his soul was made by God breathing into him the breath of life, and man became a living soul. We're going to come back to that and other aspects and do a review after we go through chapter 3 in the fall and see how this affects humanity and see who were we made to be and how did the fall affect that. So I'm going to answer the question a little bit better and clearer that Janice asked last week about, this being a living soul and the spirit and how does God interact with that. We'll deal with that a little bit more down the road as kind of a review. And then we come to verse 8. And if someone would read verses 8 and 9.
And the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed, and out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food, the tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil.
Okay, so the first thing there we notice is that that God planted a garden. God made a special creation within the creation for Adam and Eve to live. And so in verse 9, he says it's eastward in Eden. Now, we don't really know the exact placement of the garden. We'll come back to that in a moment. But it was eastward, meaning east of where Moses was and where the Israelites were. So the Israelites are out on the Mediterranean. East of them, where we think it is like where Iraq is today. But in that kind of an area. So it's east of it. And Moses is writing this in the Sinai Peninsula, where Saudi Arabia is now. And so as he's writing that, he's saying, the garden was to the east. And so we don't know where the garden is. God knows where it was. That's what matters. we're going to another garden, that's paradise. But he put the man who he had formed, he put him there. Notice again, in chapter 1, it says God spoke. Then we get to chapter 2, and he's talking, God formed Adam of the dust of the ground. And again, that is something that's very personal, very, God's doing very up close and personal in this. And that is a theme of this passage, especially as we get toward the creation of woman out of man. So verse 9, how many types or categories of trees are there in verse 9? There's what? The tree of
Life.
The tree of
life. There's the tree of the
Good and evil.
knowledge of good and evil. And then what are the other ones? Yeah. So they were all the other trees that were good for food to eat. So they were all pleasant. So hold on to that thought, because we'll come back to that. But so a lot that the trees, every tree to grow, that it was pleasant to the sight and good for food. Again, Eve's going to notice that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil looked good, So they all looked good. The tree of life was in the midst of the garden. And on page 13 of your outline, Joseph Benson, the commentator, states the tree of life was the sign of life and the continuance of life and happiness on condition of his persevering in obedience. So it is believed that the tree of life was there, and that, I know in my mind, I kind of thought, well, they didn't eat that tree. Well, whether or not they did, they could have. And it's believed that it was there, and it was God's way of giving them life, because they, as human beings, they were not eternal in and of themselves. Their holiness, their happiness, their life came from God and continually comes from God. And so the tree of life was one way in which they could eat of that tree, and it would be the continuance of their life. I think I got confused there, but